So Putin might be about to make his biggest mistake of the war, his greatest miscalculation of the entire war. And it's not really about Ukraine. And that's the interesting thing. We'll get to that, but we have five big stories today. It is Tuesday, January 14th. So the first story is this: Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico declines Zelensky's invitation to Kyiv to discuss gas transit. Now, they've had a war of words for the last few days going back and forth. Fico said something, Zelensky responded, Fico said something else. So Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, who recently met with Vladimir Putin, will not visit Kyiv despite an invitation from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The invitation, it looks like, was only a tweet. Okay, come to Kyiv on Friday, Ukrainian president wrote on X. So it wasn't that great of a thing, but you would think that he would want to meet with Zelensky, but he's more than happy to meet with Putin, but not with Zelensky, which tells you a lot about where he stands. Okay, the second big story is this. We've talked a lot about these underwater sea cables and what's going on in the Baltic Sea. Now, Sweden reports signs of anchor damage on the Nordblatt energy cable linking Sweden to Lithuania. The damage is believed to have been caused by the Chinese vessel Yi Peng 3. Now, they were accusing the Chinese vessel Yi Peng 3 of doing this before, earlier, but they didn't have any proof. They've now gone down and looked and seen, like, it looks like there's some damage, which severed the cables between Sweden, Lithuania, Germany, and Finland. So this goes back to what happened a month or so ago. It's not something recent, but it looks like there was more damage than what they thought. Now, the Finns put an end to this. Now, this was on December 30th, I believe, and when the Finns boarded the other ship and then kind of detained it, and you haven't heard boo from these tankers since. Now, we'll talk more about what those tankers are actually doing or maybe not doing since the sanctions of the Biden administration, and that's very significant as well. Okay, I want you to watch this. This is the chief of NATO talking about what peace should look like.
The future of European and global security hinges on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. We all want this war to end, but above all, we want a peace to last. I don't know how or when the war will end, but I do know peace will not last if Putin gets his way in Ukraine, because then he will press ahead. Peace will not last if war ends with a deal where Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un and the regime in Tehran are high-fiving each other, feeling empowered.
Now, that's really interesting that he lumped those groups together, not just Putin, but Xi and North Korea's Kim and Tehran, right? Okay, we'll come back to Tehran in just a moment, because that's where the big mistake might be. Okay, NATO poses a threat to Putin's imperial ambitions, but not Russia's national security. I think that's a very fair statement. So it's not something that is like Russia seems to have this, oh no, we're embattled on all sides, we have to do something about it. But NATO's not trying to take over Russian territory, where Russia is trying to take over other territory that doesn't belong to it. Now, Poland supports Donald Trump's call for NATO countries to allocate 5% of GDP to defense spending, even if achieving this goal takes a decade. So he stated that Poland could, this is the defense minister, stated that Poland could serve as a transatlantic link to bridge the gap between Trump's challenge and its implementation in Europe. Poland is currently leading NATO in defense spending, allocating 4.7% of GDP this year, the highest among member states. In contrast, only 23 of NATO's 32 member states have met the 2% GDP spending target. The minister described Trump's proposed target as an important wake-up call for the alliance, adding, "It will take another decade to achieve Trump's goal, but he shouldn't be criticized for setting an ambitious target. Without it, some countries will continue debating the necessity of increased spending." But see, this is actually a good thing that they're moving that direction, because Russia is a serious threat and they need to counter it by getting themselves together sooner rather than later. If we don't do this, and he was talking about increasing spending above 2%, he wasn't talking about the 5% target, but if we don't do this, in 4 or 5 years, we'll either have to take Russian language courses or move to New Zealand. Now, I think that's pretty fair that he's saying, like, we have to get it together and increase our spending on arms and defense. Okay, Reports from the time, this is the big story now. This is the one where I think Putin can actually potentially make a miscalculation here that could just be devastating for him, and I'll explain why. Reports from the Times indicates that Iran is engaged in covert nuclear discussions with Russia. Now, a senior advisor to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is reportedly in Russia to meet with high-ranking officials. The focus of these talks is believed to be securing Russian support for Iran's nuclear program and bolstering its air defense systems. Now, let's put some things in perspective. Russia's okay with breaking sanctions around the world to make sure that Iran has things that it wants, like a nuclear program. Now, remember, the Trump administration, Trump particularly can't stand Iran. Trump particularly supports Israel. And so linking to Iran in a more meaningful way will be very bad for him negotiating moving forward. Now, here's an article from the Times of Israel. Iran and Russia to ink strategic partnership deal as Tehran seeks money and arms. Now, it depends on how far that strategic partnership goes. If it's a strategic partnership of you get this and I get that, and it's a very limited transactional thing, that's one thing. But if it turns out to be something like a North Korean style, if you're invaded, I'll protect you, and if I'm invaded, you protect me, and then they extended it to Belarus, if they extend that to Iran, that's going to go very, very poorly for him, because the Trump administration is, again, said its face like flint against Iran. Okay. The Russian President Vladimir Putin will host his Iranian counterpart this week for the signing of a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty between Moscow and Tehran, the Kremlin said on Monday. Again, this is in the Times of Israel. Putin and the Iranian president will discuss plans for expanding trade and cooperation in transport, logistics, humanitarian spheres, along with acute issues on the regional and international agenda during a visit to Moscow. Well, what does that mean? We don't exactly know yet. Tehran has long hoped to obtain advanced Sukhoi Su-35 fighter jets from Russia to upgrade its aging fleet that's been hobbled by international sanctions. President-elect Donald Trump, who's pledged to broker a peace deal on Ukraine, but who is thought to likely take a harder line against Iran. Now, and if so, he takes a harder line against Iran, and if Iran is linking, the closer Iran links with Russia, the worse it is going to be for Putin in those kind of deals. Tehran likely hopes to secure financial and defense promises from Moscow. Putin signed a similarly named treaty with North Korea last year, further strengthening his alliance with Pyongyang. And that was a precursor to the greater treaty that became like this mutual assistance compact. Under that agreement, both sides committed to provide military assistance in case the other was invaded or attacked. North Korea has since sent thousands of soldiers to fight Ukrainian troops. So if it's that kind of deal, this will be Putin's downfall. It'll be his worst possible mistake, because it'll set the United States completely against, because he's linked with Iran. Okay, here it is in India today. So I'm not making this stuff up. You can read these for yourself. Okay, this deepening partnership between Tehran and Moscow is not one-sided. Russia is heavily reliant on Iranian drones and missiles to support its military operations in Ukraine. Iranian drones have caused significant damage to Ukrainian infrastructure, leading to fears of an expanding Tehran-Moscow nexus. That's what the West is really concerned about, that expanding Tehran-Moscow nexus. In return for Iran's military support, Russia appears willing to cross previously established red lines, offering Iran both military and technological expertise that could accelerate its nuclear ambitions. So this could be a treaty with far-reaching implications. The collaboration is set to escalate further. During the visit, that's the president of Iran, is expected to sign a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty which the Kremlin claims will have expanded trade, logistics, humanitarian cooperation. However, many view the treaty as a formal alignment of military and political interests. So if that happens, this will be, it's weird to think that this could be the thing that is Putin's greatest mistake in Ukraine, when it's not about Ukraine itself, but because the international geopolitics matter, that could cause some significant backlash from the West. Okay, now let's shift our attention to American politics and what's going on here. President Biden put this out just yesterday. As I saw it, when Putin launched his invasion, I had two jobs: to rally the world to defend Ukraine, one, and two, to avoid war between two nuclear powers. We did both. And we've laid the foundation for the next administration to preserve a bright future for the Ukrainian people. Well, okay, I mean, you kind of, but there are other people who have other views. This is Michael McCall. He's a Republican. So now the Republican's going to have a diametrically opposed view to what the Democrat president just said. Today, President Biden made a last-ditch effort to whitewash his disastrous foreign policy record and rewrite his legacy. He brazenly claimed that the U.S. is stronger and our adversaries weaker than when he gained office, but Americans will not forget it was his administration's weakness that led to hot wars on two continents and a hot zone in the Indo-Pacific. So you can take that and look at it either way. I'm not trying to persuade you one way or another, but it doesn't look like Biden has really done a great job in accomplishing his aims. Igor Shushko posted this, fact check, when Putin invaded, the White House also believed that he would conquer Ukraine in a matter of days, which is why the U.S. pressured Zelensky to flee. Kyiv still stands only because Zelensky refused. We shouldn't celebrate our catastrophic intelligence failures like that, and I think that's also a fair point. Now, I want to give Biden credit where credit is due because, I'm not trying to slap either any direction. I'm trying to show you what's going on. So Biden's administration just put these massive sanctions on oil tankers. Now, at least 65 oil tankers dropped anchor after the new U.S. sanctions package. So after I was talking about this yesterday, about the 5 ships off the Chinese coast, people were skeptical about that. And I understand. Well, maybe they're just doing that for a PR stunt or something along these lines. Well, 5 are off the Chinese ports, 7 more dropped anchor near Singapore, others halted closer to Russia in the Baltic Sea and in the Far East. According to experts, around 10% of the global oil tanker fleet is now subject to U.S. sanctions, and many of those shouldn't be out in the water at all. They're just not up to speed or up to standards. Now, Jake Sullivan is Biden's national security advisor, and Yulia Mendel, who wrote the book Fight of Our Lives, working with Zelensky, said this about Sullivan. Sullivan suggested that the Ukrainian army faces manpower shortage and advocates for a lower age of mobilization. It seems he may soon find himself out of a job. We extend an invitation to him to join us in the Ukrainian trenches. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican who supports Ukraine, there's a bipartisan consensus that it'll be good to see Jake Sullivan go. Garry Kasparov said the only thing that can save Russia in Ukraine and possibly Putin's entire regime is Western weakness. Putin is desperately looking for lifelines like summits and negotiations, and he's responding here to Tender, saying while Russian battlefield losses are escalating and the Soviet-era depots are depleting, the last sanctions package targeting Russia's shadow fleet of 183 ships is further tightening the noose around Russia's economic neck. Now, again, Western weakness can come either from the Biden administration or the Trump administration, so it's yet to see what Trump is about to do. But even Trump is saying this. Now, Trump is planning to meet with Putin as soon as possible after the inauguration, and he said, quote, well, there's only one strategy to end the war, and it depends on Putin. I can't imagine he's thrilled with how things are going because it's not exactly good for him either. That was Trump. I talked about that today. Huge damage after Ukraine's largest attack on Russia, targeting oil and infrastructure and ammunition depots and all kinds of things. Now, according to the Kyiv Post, Trump's team also supports the idea of using the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets as leverage against the Kremlin. Now, that could be good or bad. I don't know. It depends on how the deal goes. But I don't think it's going to affect Putin's calculation a whole lot. It affects his oligarchs, but it doesn't really affect Putin. Maybe it'll affect the oligarchs and they can put pressure, but I don't see them putting a lot of pressure on. And in principle, that $300 billion in frozen assets should return, but there should also simultaneously be reparations to Ukraine that pay the damages for what Russia has done. We'll see how this all plays out. Now, I saw this and I thought, yeah, there's something to it. The agreements signed by Russia aren't worth the price of the sheet of paper that they're written on. Now, I always want to be fair, and here's the full quote. It's from Otto von Bismarck. Do not expect that once taking advantage of Russia's weakness, you will receive dividends forever. Russia has always come for their money. And when they come, do not rely on an agreement signed by you. You are supposed to justify. They are not worth the paper it is written on. Therefore, with the Russian is to play fair or do not play. So that's a different quote than what it sounded like. And in fairness, we should say, don't take advantage of Russia. But it's not that we're taking advantage of Russia. It's Russia constantly feels taken advantage of, whether they're taken advantage of or not. And it's also worth noting that Russia violates agreement after agreement after agreement after agreement after agreement. All right, my friends, that's all that I have. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes and the shares and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.